It's the early 1980s, and you kind of want to flaunt your wealth, but not overtly so. And so a Cadillac is just a little bit too showy for you. Well, what do you want to pick instead? Perhaps a beautiful Riviera Convertible. Now, the Riviera was introduced in 1963. The first generation ran from 1963 through 1965. The second generation, 1966 through 1970. The third generation, 1971 through 1976, the fourth generation, just briefly, 1977 and 8, and the fifth generation, which is what we're going to talk about here, ran from 1979 to 1985. And in 1979, in that model year, the Riviera would, for the first time, transition to front-wheel drive, along with its other platform mates, the Oldsmobile Toronado, which debuted in 1966 and was always a front-wheel drive car throughout its lifetime, and the Cadillac Eldorado, which the front-wheel drive version of the Eldorado debuted for 1967. So the Riviera moves to front-wheel drive for the first time in 1979, along with its other E-platform stablemates. And remember, this was a time frame in which it was thought that there were not going to be any more convertibles produced because of safety standards, more specifically rollover standards, and convertible tops obviously just could not survive a rollover. The soft top convertible tops could not survive a rollover and protect passengers. Well, those standards got relaxed, and even though Cadillac had produced its so-called last convertible in 1976, just a few model years later, in 1982, the convertibles would be back. And Buick introduced in 1982 its first ever Riviera convertible. We're going to talk about this particular copy, this 1983 copy, which was the second model year for the Riviera convertible. Now, the first thing to note about the Riviera convertibles was that they were extremely expensive. Yes, it was a Buick, it wasn't a Cadillac, but the base price of a Riviera convertible was about $24,000 in the early 1980s, the equivalent of over $80,000 today. They were extremely expensive. And as a result, they didn't sell too many. These convertibles were produced from 1982 to 1985, and they sold a little under 4,000 across all model years, the 1982 model year being the most popular. Now, this particular Riviera convertible that we're going to walk around and discuss is a 1983 model year. One of the ways to tell the 1983 model year from the 1982, the inaugural model year, is the grille texture. Of course, designers like to make little changes every year, at least during this time frame. And unlike the 1950s where they changed the entire sheet metal on the front end, well, now they're just making minor changes. The grille texture on the 1983 has a more dominant vertical theme than just a pure egg crate pattern, which the 1982 did. So it's one way to tell your 83 Riv from the 82. And by the way, that kind of worked, in particular because for 1984, the grille texture would change yet again to be a completely vertically oriented theme dominated by very thin vertical bars, very classic Buick for 1984. But 1983, you get a little bit of a hybrid between the 82 and the 84 grille. That was something that designers often did to kind of walk you into the next year's styling theme. Not change all at once, but change progressively over the course of the model years. Now, as we look at the design of this car is kind of interesting in a number of ways. One is that undulating belt line that kind of continues the hood's formation and almost looks like the car has a wave overall on the belt line. It just kind of goes up and down and up and down. And it allows for the car to have a nice taper in the front and the rear, something very characteristic of General Motors design during this time frame. And you also have something that a number of GM cars were displaying during this time frame. I call it the underbite front end, because the bumper is protruding further out than the top of the header panel there, and the grille is kind of slanted backward, almost like a cow catcher on a train. I think that what GM was trying to go for was more of a regal, pardon the pun, appearance on the front end here, as opposed to a car that looked like it was in motion while it was standing still. In that case, you'd often have an overbite front end where the bumper was further inset versus the header panel. Although I think, given the bumper standards, that was also hard to execute. So GM designers just made the best of it and rocked the grille back and gave the front end a nice, timeless kind of look. And as we rotate around to the passenger side here, I have to say that the front end theme reminds me a little bit of Pontiac themes from the early 1970s. Take a look at the inset. You just have to imagine that the shoulders there on the midsection of the hood would pull inward a bit further such that they would form an arrowhead. And then you kind of have the typical Pontiac front end of the early 1970s with a high fender, then that so-called catwalk area, a little bump maybe even, or a crease over the headlamps. And then again, if it had that arrowhead front end, it would be even more Pontiac-like. But that was a very Pontiac-style front end that for some reason Buick elected to go with on this particular Riviera. I am not entirely sure why. Maybe designers just thought that, Pontiac had a good thing going, and they were also trying to get some romance in the car. The 77 to 78 Riviera really was just a sales flop. It was a warmed over LeSabre, and so designers were trying to get some more form and shape to the car as opposed to the 77 and 78 that really were pretty slab-sided and architectural. This Riviera, especially that undulating belt line, which you saw on other GM cars of the era, think the 1978 Grand Prix, another car that had it, just gave it something that was a little bit different from what the typical buyer would normally see. Now, as we rotate to the side view, this is probably the most unfortunate angle on this car. I think the dead-on front, dead-on rear, the front and rear three-quarter don't look too bad, but a lot of GM cars of this era suffered from wheelbases that just appeared too short, and I think that designers were struggling to get these large-bodied cars over top of wheelbases that were shrinking. And you saw this on other GM cars of the era, like the A-body cars, the Grand Prix I just mentioned, the Cutlass, the Regal, the Monte Carlo. I was actually dialoguing with a friend earlier today about this, John Manoogian, who, by the way, if you haven't read his column in Driven to Right, check that out. Just Google Driven to Right, John Manoogian, and you can see his column. John was the designer for many years at General Motors, culminating in his lead stewardship of the Cadillac brand. He was the design chief for Cadillac Exterior, but prior to that, he also led Pontiac Exterior Studios, was an assistant chief for Cadillac. Prior to that, an assistant chief for Saturn. Read his column and learn more about it, shall we say. In any case, like I said, the wheelbase on this car just doesn't look quite right. It looks like that rear wheel needs to go further rearward and the front wheel needs to go further forward, give it a little more dash to axle. But like I said, that was just a proportion of the time. I think designers, as I mentioned, were trying to just get the form of the body and maybe not paying as much attention to the wheelbase and the constraints associated with it. And you ended up with the overhangs that you saw here, exacerbated by the bumper standards too. At least this car has the nice optional wheels on it as opposed to the standard wheel covers. It looks good overall. Now, as we rotate along to the rear three-quarter view, I think that this isn't quite as strong as the front three-quarter view, but it definitely does have some nice elements. Not only do you have that tapering rear deck, you also have this kind of slanted deck lid that curls over, and then that portion that is forming the tail lamps kind of as a similar angle to the front end, a little bit of the so-called underbite rear end, I guess, here too on the car. I do like the reverse light detail in the middle of the tail lamps. One thing I don't like about this is that rear bumper protrudes quite a bit, and notice the bumper filler panels here, which invariably by this day and age generally crack or deform a little bit. And because of that, it just doesn't look quite right. This would look much better if that were all done in sheet metal or something that was hard as opposed to that rubber flubber stuff. But that's what they had to do to meet the bumper standard, so oh well. I must say that this car looks great in this red paint. I believe you could only get convertibles in two colors, exterior colors, red and then white. And then the interiors were always this red color, which we're going to talk about now. And here we have the interior of this 83 Riviera with this beautiful red leather in kind of a ribbed theme. Interesting, I think Cadillac would rip off this theme only for 1 year in its front-wheel drive C-body cars in 1985. But for whatever reason, after 1 year, they would change the interior seat stitch pattern. But oh well. Of course, here you also have a little consolette, not a full center console in this Riviera. You do have a beautifully flat floor for the first time in a Riviera too, because this car, as I mentioned before, was front-wheel drive. And Look at that supersized accelerator pedal and brake pedal there. Not going to miss that. You, of course, have lots of faux wood grain on the dash, on the door panels. Interestingly, the faux wood grain that surrounds the door handle also encompasses a speaker grill for the stereo system. And these e-cars, the e-cars I'm referring to are the Tornado, the Riviera, and the Eldorado, all had this rather tall dash and had kind of like a hooded instrument panel, although the Riviera's hood, the IP top pad, is not one that overhangs as much as the Eldorado as an example. But still an overall attractive design, although it's kind of old-fashioned by this point, very boxy, kind of like the car itself. Here's another view of the instrument panel, and you can see what I mean. It's pretty boxy overall. It almost has three different modules, that left, the center, and the right. And I believe part of that, the reason why that came about was so that this car could be sold overseas in markets where they were right-hand drive. Same with the Cadillac. So you could easily just take that left portion of the gauge cluster and invert it with the right portion, keep the center section the same, and, well, you could export this car for right-hand drive markets. Obviously, you had to make other modifications under hood too, but at least in terms of interior modifications, it was relatively minor and simple. It appears this car also has that litter container in the passenger side footwell. And one thing that GM did on these front-wheel drive cars is they had one big floor mat for the front, which I kind of like, but I also kind of didn't. It was a little bit harder to remove that entire floor mat. It's pretty heavy too. This was not a light floor mat. This was back in the days when they made real floor mats. So I think they eventually went away from that and bifurcated it because it was heavy and bulky and unwieldy to try to get out of the car. Now let's move under hood. In your Riviera for 1983, you could actually get your choice of 4 engines, 3 gas and 1 diesel. The standard engine was a 125 horsepower, 4.1 liter Buick V6. That was based on the same architecture as the Buick 3.8 that would later become the 3800 engine. Yeah, the 4.1 was an okay engine. It had a little bit of the shakes. Remember, it was a 90-degree V6. Did have some things done to it to help make it more even firing, but I wouldn't call that a great motor. Back then, the 3.8 and the 4.1 weren't the 300,000-mile engines that they would be when they would become the 3800. They would last to about 120,000 miles, something like that, before they tended to have some problem. Then one up from that was the optional 5-liter Olds 307 V8. It made 140 horsepower. And that Olds 307, while not all that powerful, was reliable and smooth and very long-lasting. So that was a great engine in these vehicles. And then optional in the Riviera beyond that was the 180 horsepower turbocharged 3.8-liter V6 engine. That was standard in the T-types, optional in all the others. And the last engine that you could get in your 83 Riviera was Oldsmobile's 5.7-liter, 105 horsepower, 350 cubic inch diesel, which, by this point, it actually wasn't that bad. It was pretty reliable. They had redone the block to make it more durable, but still not that great of an engine. So unfortunately, this was not the age of big power under hood in these Rivieras, although there was one of these Rivieras that paced the Indianapolis 500, and Buick put a turbocharged 4.1-liter V6 under hood to give it some extra oomph. But, well, if you were just John Q. Public, you had to make do with one of the 4 engine choices that I just mentioned. And to close out, here's an underneath shot of this particular Riviera. I thought it was interesting to show because you can see the final drive unit there and one of the half shafts that comes off to drive the passenger side wheel. Of course, there's another one on the driver's side. Clearly unequal length half shafts, but amazingly, these cars really don't have torque steer. Maybe that's because some of the engines don't have that much torque, but they were engineered pretty well. And I would say a fun fact is that in 1966, Buick actually engineered that final drive unit for the Oldsmobile Tornado and later Cadillac Eldorado, despite the fact that Riviera never used it. So Buick engineered a piece that they never used, and they ended up selling it to their sister divisions. You can also see the torsion bars here, those big longitudinal bars on either side. The front suspension here has no coil springs. It has torsion bars, kind of a la Chrysler products of the day. Of course, Chrysler products during this era had transverse torsion bars. By and large, here you have longitudinal torsion bars, but torsion bars nonetheless. And they give the car a pretty good ride overall. So what are your thoughts on this Riviera? Would you have bought something like this and paid that exorbitant price back in the day? Let me know and put a comment in the comment section. Thanks again for watching.